When a person finally decides to stop reaching out, truly stop, they cross an unseen boundary that most people never dare to approach. And that's because this decision isn't merely about silence. It's about identity. It's about reclaiming a part of yourself that you surrendered, often unconsciously, to someone who fed on your uncertainty, your hope, and your emotional work. When you refuse to reach out again, you interrupt a psychological pattern that may have defined you for years. Refusing to reach out breaks the psychological pattern that once kept you tied up. And to understand the full significance of that, you have to look closely at how these patterns are formed in the first place. Most people don't realize that the act of reaching out is often less about genuine connection and more about a deeply ingrained urge to restore balance, to prevent abandonment, or to soothe an internal tension that feels unbearable when left unresolved. Over time, this urge becomes automatic. It becomes the default response, the survival strategy, the emotional reflex. You don't reach out because it's the right thing to do. You reach out because it's what you've always done. Because the silence becomes too loud, because the anxiety feels like it's pushing you from the inside. So when you finally decide not to reach out again, you're not just withholding a message or a call, you're interrupting the entire structure of conditioning that kept you emotionally involved. There is something profoundly transformative in that interruption. The human mind builds routines, even unhealthy ones, simply because they are familiar. Familiarity feels safe even when it hurts. So breaking that pattern creates a kind of inner shock. You suddenly realize that you are capable of choosing differently, that the expected reaction is not the inevitable one. That moment of awareness is the first step toward reclaiming the self-rule you surrendered over time. You begin to see that the power you assumed the other person held over you was in many cases power you handed to them piece by piece through every moment you chose, repair over self-respect and pursuit over self-preservation. When you refuse to reach out, you confront the discomfort that your old pattern tried to avoid. The silence will feel heavy at first. Your mind will try to pull you back into the known cycle, reminding you of past moments when you're reaching out resolved tension or temporarily restored peace. But this time, you are choosing to face that discomfort instead of running from it. And in that choice, your inner structure begins to reorganize. You learn to sit with anxiety rather than soothe it through external validation. You learn to tolerate uncertainty instead of trying to control it with your effort. You learn that not every conflict, distance, or disconnect must be solved immediately, especially when solving it only leads you back into the same loop. This is where the psychological shift deepens. When you stop reaching out, you stop feeding the emotional dynamic that once defined the relationship. If the other person depended on your effort, your vulnerability, or your willingness to initiate contact, the absence of those behaviors forces a resetting. Their expectations meet your new boundaries and something gives. Sometimes it's their composure, sometimes it's their indifference, sometimes it's their illusion of superiority. But something will shift, and the most shocking part is that the shift doesn't begin in them. It begins in you. You start to see that your value does not increase or decrease based on someone else's reaction. You realize that your worth is not negotiated through how much you give, how quickly you respond, or how consistently you show up, even when they don't. Breaking the pattern gives you access to a part of yourself you may have ignored, the part that knows how to stand still, how to say no, how to choose peace over chaos. The act of not reaching out becomes a quiet declaration that you are no longer willing to sacrifice your emotional stability to maintain a connection that requires you to lessen yourself. And as you hold that silence, you begin to grow into it. What felt like emptiness transforms into CL. Arity, what felt like loss becomes space. What felt like powerlessness reveals itself as strength. You begin to understand that you were never weak for wanting connection, but you become stronger when you learn to stop chasing it at the expense of your dignity. This refusal creates a ripple effect inside you. You notice yourself becoming more present, more grounded, more aware of your own needs and limits. You discover that the world doesn't collapse when you stop trying to rescue someone from their own emotions or from their own ego. You learn that not every distance must be bridged, not every silence must be filled, and not every broken pattern must be repaired. Some of them are meant to fall apart so that you can finally see your own reflection without twisting. And as the pattern breaks, you begin to reclaim every part of yourself that was tied to that old cycle. The part that was always apologizing, the part that always feared rejection, the part that believed silence meant failure, the part that assumed your value depended on effort. All those pieces start to come back to you piece by piece as you hold your boundary calmly and consistently. You realize that you are capable, standing firm even when your emotions surge, or when the urge to fix things tries to pull you back. You discover that you can endure discomfort without betraying yourself. You learn that self-respect is built not in grand declarations, but in small, quiet, difficult decisions like this one. The breaking of the pattern becomes an awakening. It becomes the moment where you stop living reactively and start living intentionally. It becomes the turning point where you refuse to let old conditioning dictate your future. And as you hold that line, as you refuse to reach out again, you begin to witness the unfolding of a transformation that was waiting for you to choose yourself first. Your silence becomes a powerful boundary that forces clarity into the situation. And to recognize the magnitude of this, you have to understand how rarely people commit to genuine silence with intention. Most silence in human interactions is accidental, passive, or temporary. It's the kind that comes from exhaustion or frustration, not from a deliberate choice rooted in self-respect. But when you choose silence on purpose, when you decide not to explain, not to justify, not to chase, you create a boundary, stronger than any argument you could ever make. It is a boundary that does not need to be announced or defended. It simply exists. And its presence reshapes the psychological dynamic between you and the other person in ways that words never could. Silence dismantles illusion. As long as you keep engaging, the other person can continue believing whatever narrative they've constructed about you, that you need them more than they need you, that you'll always return, that your emotional availability is guaranteed, that your presence is a constant. But when you stop reaching out and hold that silence, the narrative begins to fall apart. They no longer have the comfort of your predictability. They no longer have the assurance that you'll be the one to patch over the cracks. And that uncertainty becomes a mirror, reflecting back to them the fragility of the dynamic they once felt so secure in. Silence also clarifies your own internal landscape. When you are constantly responding, explaining, or reaching out, you don't give yourself the space to hear your own thoughts without the interference of someone else's expectations. Your mind becomes occupied with rehearsing outcomes, imagining reactions, and anticipating the emotional turbulence that might follow. But once you choose silence intentionally, your internal dialogue changes. The noise begins to settle. You start to see your own motives more clearly. You realize how much mental energy you were investing in managing someone else's emotions and how little space you were leaving for your own. In that silence, you also confront the fears that were driving your previous behavior, the fear of losing someone, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being seen as cold or indifferent, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being replaced. These fears often operate beneath the surface, steering your actions without you fully recognizing their influence. When you stop reaching out, those fears rise to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. And though it may feel uncomfortable, this confrontation is necessary. It allows you to recognize which fears are real and which ones were conditioned responses to a dynamic that kept you emotionally dependent. The boundary created by silence also exposes the other person's relationship with responsibility. When you're always the one initiating, repairing, or smoothing things, the other person never has to face the consequences of their actions or inactions. They never have to question their own behavior or consider how it affects you. But when silence enters the equation, responsibility becomes unavoidable. If they want clarity, they must seek it. If they want connection, they must contribute to it. If they want the dynamic to continue, they must engage with intention rather than entitlement. Silence removes the cushion that once protected them from the discomfort of introspection. Your silence forces them to evaluate what they actually value. Was the connection meaningful to them, or was it convenient? Were they participating, or were they merely benefiting from your emotional work? Did they care about you as a person, or did they care about what you provided? These questions surface naturally in the absence of your effort. Silence becomes a filter that reveals their true priorities, unclouded by your attempts to maintain harmony. It shows you whether they are capable of stepping forward or whether they retreat when the responsibility shifts to them. Silence also strengthens you in ways that are not immediately obvious. It teaches you restraint, discipline, and emotional independence. It teaches you that you do not need to react to every impulse or validate every feeling through external responses. It teaches you how to observe your emotions without being controlled by them. In the stillness, you learn to differentiate between longing and attachment, between love and habit, between connection and dependency. You begin to understand that not every emotion requires action, and not every thought requires expression. As you continue holding that silence, you notice how your perception shifts. You no longer interpret the other person's behavior through the lens of your own hopes or fears. You start to see things as they are. Their patterns become clearer. Their investment or lack of it becomes undeniable. Without your effort filling in the gaps, you can finally see who contributes and who merely consumes. Clarity becomes a natural byproduct of this boundary, revealing truths that were previously obscured by your constant participation. In many ways, your silence becomes a declaration of self-worth. It communicates that you will no longer overextend yourself, that you will no longer tolerate one-sided dynamics, and that you are willing to lose someone rather than lose yourself. It signals that you are no longer available to be taken for granted. It shows that you trust your own judgment enough to enforce boundaries without needing external approval. And as the silence continues, something shifts deep within you. The emotional weight you once carried begins to lift. The urgency you used to feel starts to fade. You discover a steadiness that comes from choosing yourself, even when it's difficult. You realize that your silence is not emptiness. It is protection. It is clarity. It is strength. It is the boundary that separates who you were from who you are becoming. The person who relied on your emotional effort begins to feel the loss of control. And the moment that loss registers in their mind, the entire dynamic between you begins to shift in ways that are often subtle at first, but unmistakable in their deeper psychological implications. People who become accustomed to your effort grow dependent on it, not necessarily because they cherish you, but because your predictability becomes a stabilizing force for them. Your consistent reaching out, your constant willingness to repair, your instinct to initiate company, intact, all of these behaviors create a pattern they learn to expect. They start to assume that you will always be there to regulate the emotional tone of the relationship, to bridge the distance, to clean up the mess, or to soothe the tension whenever things feel unstable. And as long as you keep providing that emotional effort, they never have to face the discomfort of uncertainty or the responsibility of contributing equally. When you finally withdraw that effort, They feel the disruption long before you realize how deeply it affects them. Suddenly, the person who always waited for your message, confident that you would eventually reach out, is faced with a gap they don't know how to fill. The silence you impose is not just a boundary, it is a consequence. It is a mirror reflecting their own lack of initiative, their emotional immaturity, or their dependence on your willingness to chase. They begin to sense that something has changed, something they no longer control, something they can't predict. And that sense of unpredictability is profoundly destabilizing for people who rely on others to manage the emotional climate for them. Their reactions may vary, but the underlying psychological process is the same. For some, the loss of control manifests as confusion. They wonder why you haven't appeared in the patterns they were so sure you'd repeat. They rehearse scenarios in their minds, desperately trying to understand what broke. For others, the reaction is frustration, even anger. They may feel entitled to your attention, believing your effort was something they deserved, something they had earned simply by existing in your emotional space. The absence of your outreach forces them to confront a reality that contradicts their assumptions, that you are not obligated to maintain the connection, that your presence was a choice, not a requirement. As you maintain your silence, their internal narratives begin to fall apart. They start to realize that they no longer occupy the position of security they thought they did. If they had taken your availability for granted, that assumption begins to erode. If they believed they had emotional power over you, that power weakens. The loss of control is not just about losing your attention. It's about losing the version of you who once prioritized their needs above your own. And that loss can be startling, even threatening. To someone who relied on your emotional consistency to avoid dealing with their own issues, what they often feel most intensely is the absence of comfort. You were the stabilizer, the one who reached out when things felt uncertain, the one who healed the emotional cracks before they widened. Without your effort, those cracks become visible. They are forced to see the fragility of the connection without your constant maintenance. The stability they once attributed to the relationship begins to reveal itself as something you created, something that did not exist on its own. This realization can provoke anxiety in them because it exposes how dependent they were on your effort without contributing in return. In many cases, their behavior begins to shift in inconsistent ways as they grapple with this loss of control. Some might attempt small gestures to test your reaction, trying to see if you will break your silence. Others may pull back even further, hoping that their retreat will pressure you into stepping forward again. Some will try to manipulate the situation, subtly posting things designed to trigger a response, making indirect comments, or attempting to provoke emotion in you without addressing anything directly. These behaviors are not expressions of strength. They are signs of internal turmoil, evidence that the loss of your effort has created an imbalance they don't know how to fix. But the most important change happens within you as you observe these reactions. You begin to see clearly what your effort was sustaining. You notice how quickly things feel different when you stop reaching out. You realize how much of the emotional weight you were carrying alone. Their discomfort reveals the truth you may have ignored, that they were benefiting from your effort far more than they were contributing to the relationship. Their inability to maintain stability without your involvement becomes one of the clearest indicators of the role you played, one they likely never acknowledged. And as the distance grows, you begin to understand something even more profound. Their loss of control has nothing to do with love, connection, or genuine care. It has everything to do with losing access to the emotional work you provided, the panic, the confusion, the irritation, the subtle attempts to regain your attention. None of these reactions are rooted in regret for They treated you, they are rooted in the fear of losing the comfort that your effort brought them. The emotional ease of having you always available, always responsive, always bridging the gap. The dynamic starts to expose itself in a stark, undeniable way. You see how deeply they depended on your willingness to initiate and how little they actually offered in return. You see that the relationship functioned because you kept it alive. You see that their sense of power was sustained by your predictability, and now with your silence forcing them to sit with their own limitations, the entire structure begins to crumble. You watch in real time as the illusion of their control dissolves, revealing a truth that was hidden beneath your constant effort. And in that unfolding clarity, you begin to feel something you may not have expected: relief. Not because you wanted to hurt them, but because you finally see the reality of the connection without the distortion of your own emotional labor. That clarity becomes a source of strength, allowing you to stand firmer in your decision not to reach out. Their loss of control becomes your beginning, a moment where you reclaim the power you once ended away, and start to understand the depth of your own emotional resilience. Their unexpected reactions reveal who they truly are beneath the surface. And this revelation doesn't come from dramatic confrontations or emotionally charged exchanges. It comes quietly, almost subtly, through the way they respond to the absence of something they once counted on: your attention, your effort, your predictable presence. When you stop reaching out, you remove the familiarity that allowed their true nature to remain hidden. And in the vacuum created by your silence, their authentic behavior begins to surface. Not the behavior they showed when they felt admired, chased, or needed, but the behavior that emerges when their comfort is disrupted and their control is challenged. For many people, their true character is not revealed when things are going well. It's revealed when something they depended on is taken away, and your silence becomes that removal. Those who are genuinely invested in you might respond with concern, openness, or curiosity. They might reach out, ask if everything is okay, or seek to understand the shift. But those who relied on your emotional effort as a source of validate, ion, or control often respond very differently. Their reactions can range from impatience to passive aggression, from sudden distance to erratic attempts to regain your attention. And each of these reactions tells you something important about who they really are. For some, the first reaction is irritation, not sadness, not reflection, but annoyance. Annoyance that you dared to disrupt the pattern, that you refused to play the role they silently assigned you. Their frustration reveals a sense of entitlement, a belief that your energy was something they owned rather than something you chose to give. This kind of irritation is not about missing you. It's about missing the emotional service you provided. It shows you how they valued your effort only when it benefited them, not because it came from a genuine connection. Others might fall into silence themselves, but not for the reasons you think. Their silence is not a mirror of self-respect, but a strategic withdrawal meant to provoke you into acting first. They want to reassert control by making you doubt your decision, by triggering your old patterns, by waiting for your discomfort to force you back into the cycle. Their lack of engagement reveals their dependence on manipulation rather than communication. It shows you that they were not interacting with you, but with the version of you that gave them what they wanted without asking for responsibility. Then there are those who attempt subtle forms of attention seeking. They may post things designed to trigger jealousy or concern, send indirect messages through mutual contacts, or display sudden shifts in behavior meant to catch your eye. These are not signs of genuine care. They are signs of someone who wants your attention without having to earn it. Their actions reveal a need for validation that they once received effortlessly from you. When that validation disappears, they scramble to recreate it through indirect means, and in doing so, they show you that they value the control more than the connection. You may also encounter the reaction of indifference, or rather the performance of indifference. Some people will pretend they don't care, act unaffected, or behave as though your silence means nothing. But this performance often cracks at the edges. You see inconsistencies, moments where their calm facade slips, where their behavior betrays the internal struggle they're trying to conceal. True indifference doesn't need to be performed. It doesn't need to be emphasized or displayed. It simply exists. When someone has to show you how little they care, it's usually because the opposite is true. Their attempt to mask their discomfort reveals how dependent they were on the dynamic you've now disrupted. The most telling reactions, however, come from those who suddenly attempt to flip the narrative. They may accuse you of abandoning them, blame you for the silence, or frame themselves as the victim of your boundary. This reaction exposes their inability to take responsibility for their own emotional contribution. Rather than reflecting on their behavior, they deflect, manipulate, or rewrite the story to maintain the illusion that they were never part of the problem. Their true nature emerges through their refusal to acknowledge the role they played in the dynamic's imbalance. But perhaps the most revealing reaction of all is the reaction of nothing. The absence of any effort, any curiosity, any desire to understand the shift. This reaction isn't neutrality. It's a silent confession. It reveals that their interest in you was conditional, sustained only by what you provided. When the flow of your efforts stops, their presence evaporates, and that disappearance exposes the truth that they were never invested in you, but in the benefits your presence brought them. Their silence isn't strength. It's indifference dressed as self-control, and it is one of the clearest signs of their emotional limitations. As you watch these reactions unfold, you begin to see patterns you couldn't see before. You start to understand that their behavior was not unpredictable. It was simply disguised by the dynamic you once upheld. With your effort removed, their mask slips because it no longer serves them. Their reactions reveal their emotional maturity, their capacity for empathy, their willingness or unwillingness to take responsibility. You begin to see their priorities not through what they said, but through what they do when nothing is being given to them. And in these reactions, something else becomes clear to you. You realize that your silence wasn't just a boundary, it was a spotlight. It illuminated everything that was hidden, everything you overlooked, everything you excused out of hope or fear. It exposes the imbalance, the entitlement, the dependency, the emotional shallowness, or the genuine care. Whatever truth was buried beneath the surface. Their reactions show you whether they valued you or merely valued what you offered, whether they were partners in the connection or passive beneficiaries of your emotional work. They show you whether they were willing to meet you halfway or only willing to receive. The decision you make, pulling back your effort, withholding your presence, choosing not to reach out, exposes the imbalance that silently governed the relationship. And this exposure is not something you plan or orchestrate. It happens naturally, almost inevitably, because when the dynamic is built on uneven contributions, the removal of even one thread causes the entire structure to shift. For a long time, you may not have noticed the imbalance. You may have normalized it, rationalized it, or convinced yourself that this was simply how things were. You reached out first. You apologized first. You reconnected first. You soothed tension. You carried emotional weight. You interpreted silences. You filled gaps. You softened blows. You tried again and again because that is what your heart was conditioned to do. And the more you did, the more invisible your effort became both to the other person and in many ways to yourself. Imbalance rarely announces itself. It hides within routines. It disguises itself as caring, patience, loyalty, or understanding. You tell yourself that you're being compassionate, that you're trying to hold things together, that you're choosing forgiveness over pride. You may even believe that the relationship functions because both people care equally, even though your behavior shows otherwise. But once you stop acting, once you stop giving, the truth becomes unavoidable. The silence you create becomes a test. It reveals who was carrying the emotional load all along and who was simply benefiting from your endurance. Without your effort, the dynamic becomes exposed in a way that is almost startling. You see, perhaps for the first time, that your energy was the glue holding everything together. When you withdraw it, the connection begins to sag or collapse. Not because something new has happened, but because the reality that always existed is finally visible. The other person either steps in or they don't. They contribute or they retreat. They reach out or they disappear. And their response is no longer clouded by your constant repairing. Their behavior in the absence of your initiative shows you exactly how invested they were. It can be shocking to witness how quickly some people fall silent when you stop filling the silence for them. You begin to understand that your messages were not being returned. They were being received. Your emotional investment was not being matched. It was being consumed. Your attempts to maintain harmony were not part of a mutual effort. They were a one-sided task you assumed. And when you stop assuming it, the relationship doesn't balance out. It simply reveals the imbalance that had been operating from the beginning. This awareness can be painful because it forces you to acknowledge what you overlooked for so long. It forces you to confront the truth that you were giving more than you were receiving, trying harder than they were trying, caring with a depth that was not returned. But within this discomfort lies clarity. You begin to see the ways you made excuses for behavior that deserved responsibility, how you shielded them from the consequences of their emotional passivity, how you compensated for their lack of effort without realizing the toll it was taking on you. The exposure of imbalance also reveals your own patterns of overgiving, over-explaining, over-fixing. You see how your instinct to maintain connection sometimes prevented you from recognizing when a connection was not worthy of that level of commitment. You may notice that you were trying to earn affection, prove your worth, or stabilize someone who never intended to meet you halfway. And this realization can be liberating because it shifts the focus from them to yourself. You begin to understand that breaking the pattern is not just an act of boundary setting, it is an act of self-preservation. The other person's reaction to your silence often deepens this clarity. Some will disappear entirely, confirming the very imbalance you sensed but couldn't prove. Others will react with irritation, revealing that they valued the comfort of your effort more than the connection itself. A few might reach out, but in a way that feels mechanical or obligatory, not from a place of genuine investment. These reactions expose the truth of the dynamic long before words ever did. You don't have to guess anymore. You don't have to interpret mixed signals. The reality becomes self-evident when your effort is no longer masking their lack of it. As the imbalance becomes visible, something shifts inside you. You start to reclaim the emotional energy you once poured into a dynamic that could not sustain it. You begin to understand that relationships thrive when both people choose to show up, not when one person shows up enough for two. The more you sit with the silence, the more you recognize the immense weight you were carrying. You feel the relief that comes from putting it down and the clarity that comes from seeing the truth without the distortion of your own hope. You also start to see that intimacy built on imbalance is fragile. It may feel intense at times, but it cannot endure. It breaks the moment the giver stops giving. And while that may feel like a loss, it is actually a revelation. A relationship that collapses when you stop overfunctioning is not a relationship built on connection. It's a relationship built on dependence. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to go back to the way things were. The exposure of imbalance isn't meant to punish the other person. It's meant to awaken you. It shows you where your emotional labor was being taken for granted. It shows you who values you only when you're giving. It shows you what kind of connection you are actually participating in. And in that truth, uncomfortable as it may be, you find the freedom to choose differently, the strength to set new boundaries, and the clarity to recognize the relationships that genuinely deserve your effort from those that only survived because of it. Silence triggers their insecurity and forces them to confront their own emptiness. And this is one of the most profound consequences of withdrawing your effort from a relationship that was not balanced.